I've been taking a series of hikes across California, and one series has been taking me north towards Oregon. Shuttle hikes. I park the car, walk, get back in the car, come back the next day, walk. I happened to be back in 2016 on Road 88 in Yolo County, and I decided to park in a very unfortunate spot. I got stuck in the mud, and the next day I went back to see where I had been, and the tracks were still very clear. As we know, in California sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't, things dry out. I happened to come back to the same spot a couple of days later, and it looked like this. And then I came back a little later, and it looked like that. Still the impression of the car wheels in the mud. As a matter of fact, the next year I returned, and the mud tracks were still there, and they were still there even 2 years later. So, preserving information in mud that turns to clay can last a pretty long time. How about 3,000 years? So this is ancient cuneiform notation. The wedge shapes that date back to the Sumerians. But this is much more recent, found in Syria, and is the Hurrian hymn number 6, the earliest surviving music notation anywhere in the world, dating back to about 1400 BCE. And this performance, which I think is quite wonderful, is in F Dorian. So, fa, mi, re, do, re, mi, fa, so, te, do. What the piece really sounded like? One earlier scholar decided that it was a harmonic piece, and possibly in E Phrygian, or maybe even in C major, harmony in thirds. If it is, it's unprecedented, and here you're hearing a somewhat cheesy synthesized performance of same. Take-home message: this is so early, we really don't know what it sounded like. And finally, back to ancient Egypt, just a little more contemporary than what we just heard. And this is the Trumpet of Tutankhamun. And once again, we're kind of making it up as we go along, those ancient notes of do, so, do. But this has been done by a British trumpeter, and there are some disasters that they will recount surrounding the curse of Tutankhamun, supposed. But by the time this was performed in the early 20th century, there was an impression of ancient Egyptian music as having been realized by Giuseppe Verdi in his late 19th century opera, Aida. So is this trumpet player sort of channeling Giuseppe Verdi, channeling ancient Egyptian music? Who knows? But, once again, unquestionably, The do-so-do comes right from what we call the overtone series, and we'll deal with this finally. It's another look at acoustics, and we'll deal with this soon enough.
And so to the trumpets themselves. They are still displayed in the Cairo Museum. They are unique in that nothing like them has been found before or since. Seemingly, they are in perfect condition. One trumpet is of beaten copper, and the other of silver, chased in an intricate design. Being only 18 inches long, they are very difficult to sound. A professional trumpeter was obviously called for, so auditions were held, and the choice fell on a bandsman from one of the British Hussar regiments then stationed in Egypt. As the proposed date of the broadcast approached, letters began to come in. Many among them drew attention to the much publicized curse of Tutankhamun. In lighter vein was the headline in an American newspaper, "Tuts, toots in tootle round the world." We know the sort of thing. The broadcast was now only 2 weeks off. First attempts to blow the trumpets resulted in ear-splitting discord. Musicians assured me the instruments had been designed to sound only one note, or at most two. Nevertheless, I was determined to make them produce a simple tune, and this would call for 3 or 4. Rehearsals were held in one of the workshops well away from the museum itself, so that the noise would not disturb visitors. It was on the morning of the second rehearsal that the curse struck. The bandsman was making valiant but unsuccessful attempts to extract 3 notes from the copper trumpet, while Rex Engelbach, the keeper of the museum, and I stood by watching and trying not to hear. The door opened and in walked King Farouk. Paying an unofficial visit to the museum and hearing the extraordinary noises, he had come along to investigate. He was accompanied by the Director of Antiquities. Engelbach at once moved to greet the king. Out of the corner of my eye I had seen the bandsman, not one jot put out by the king's arrival, pick up the silver trumpet. Then came the sound of a sharp blow, followed by a tinkly noise. We spun round as one man. There, a picture of stupefaction, stood the bandsman, in his hand only the stem of the trumpet. The rest of that priceless relic lay around his feet. A moment of stunned immobility. Then all of us, including the king, were down on our knees in the dust, searching for fragments of silver. At the time, the disaster seemed inexplicable, but later it was discovered that the silver had become crystallized with the passage of the millennia and was as brittle as glass. The bandsman had the not unintelligent notion of fitting a modern bugle mouthpiece into the neck of the trumpet, but finding that the orifice was too small, he had rammed it home with the flat of his hand. In silence we laid the pieces of silver on the table. King Farouk looked at us in concern. Every effort, he commanded, should be made to repair the instrument. Above all, strict secrecy must be observed, to let it be known to the Egyptian public that their national relic had been smashed in the presence of the king by a British soldier could easily result in civil disturbance. This was the first in a series of incidents. Lucas, returning from a visit to Upper Egypt, collapsed when told of the disaster. He was taken to hospital, where his life was despaired of. The bandsman who had set in motion this chain reaction was suddenly posted to the desert. I began to wonder about the curse. Then the trumpet reappeared, restored and sounding loud and clear as before. As almost simultaneously, a trumpeter from another Hussar regiment reported for duty, bandsman Tapan. Then came the day of the broadcast, a Sunday. It was to take place in the museum at 6 o'clock in the evening, and when I left my bungalow around 5:30, I was in a fair state of nerves. I drove alongside the Nile, grateful for the lack of traffic, when from a concealed turning clattered a runaway horse and carriage, forcing me onto the pavement against a lamppost. Although damaged, the car was drivable, and it was a shaken man who proceeded at a snail's pace for the remainder of the journey. At the museum, I was instantly surrounded by an excited group of engineers, journalists, and photographers. They had been trying to contact me, but my phone seemed to be out of order. The guards had refused to let them into the museum, which was closed on Sundays. Engelbach, the keeper, could not be found. The situation was desperate. The sun had set, the darkness was closing in. To my relief, Engelbach appeared in the museum with the museum key. The whole group of us raced up marble staircases and along echoing corridors to the galleries selected for the broadcast, only to discover that the electric power had failed. By the gleam of a pocket torch, the engineers began feverishly to connect their apparatus to batteries and lines, while I rounded up two bewildered watchmen and firmly took possession of their electric lanterns to provide light for Lucas and one for me to read by. In all that great building there were only 2 points of light, one where the engineers were struggling to get in touch with London, the other held above my head, where it cast a pallid gleam on the drawn face of Lucas as he stood near the microphone. 5 minutes to go. Then abruptly the watchman's lantern failed. Looking back, it seems impossible, yet they flickered and died, both of them, and we were plunged into darkness. Miraculously, someone produced a candle, and with only that tiny flame flickering above the script in our hands, we were suddenly through to London and the BBC. 1 minute to go. From the corner of my eye I can see Lucas striving to look unconcerned, but the quivering of the script in his hand betrays his agitation. The half-seen treasures of Tutankhamun are in their cases all about us, grotesque and faintly menacing. Somebody clatters down the stairs, and something like a shudder runs through us while the echoes of his footsteps die eerily in the distance. Slowly the second hand creeps to 6 o'clock. The voice of the announcer sounds in my headphones. We are now taking you over to the Cairo Museum. My cue.
And now the 2 trumpets will be blown by bandsman James Tapper, who is here by permission of the Colonel and officers of the 11th Prince Albert's Own Hussars. I must explain that neither trumpet is easy to sound, and this is particularly true of the copper instrument. The silver one will be heard first.
I shoot a rapid glance into the shadows beyond the microphone. Bandsman Tapper has raised the trumpet to his lips. Pray heaven it's the silver one as arranged. I catch Engelbach's eye, and he nods encouragingly. Charles Workman, the announcer, is now standing, his face the colour of parchment, ready to give the introduction. I have reached his cue. I raise my hand. I can see him draw a great breath, and then his voice rings out.
The trumpets of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun, Lord of the Crowns, King of the South and North, Son of Re.
What fine high-sounding titles they are, and how his voice goes rolling down the corridors of time after 3,000 years. I look towards bandsman Tapper, and standing stiffly at the ready, trumpet to lips, awaiting my signal. He seems least affected of us all. Engelbach is leaning forward, rigid. Intense moment this. Time and space will be bridged. We were to cross the gulf dividing us from ancient Egypt, and for a few seconds breathe life into her dead bones. I drop my hand, and sharp and clear, this silver voice of Egypt's glorious past goes echoing to the 4 corners of the earth.
notice that upper dough is a little flat. Well, it's an old trumpet. It's tired and damaged by this point. Oh, and by the way, King Tut directly followed Akhenaten, the first pharaoh the only pharaoh who posited one god rather than many. And this was about the time of the ancient Israelites being captive in Egypt. So what does that say? And King Tut was actually an obscure enough pharaoh that his tomb was forgotten, and that is the reason that it was preserved. The old pyramids in the Old Kingdom had really been an advertisement shouting out, hey, there are buried kings here. But the Valley of the Kings that was used for burials in the New Kingdom was a valley in Upper Egypt. I went bicycling there one time, taking a ferry across the Nile River. Wonderful. And there are pyramidal shapes there, but know that they're natural. There are no man-made structures. And King Tut's burial place was covered over and immediately used the huts for the construction team for the next burial were built right over King Tut's tomb, and that's the only reason why it was preserved, because it was forgotten. And the treasures in King Tut's tomb, as marvelous as they are probably much less than would have been for a longer-lived ruler. How did King Tut die? Well, that's another questionable matter. He was a child king, died as a teenager, and under his, quote, rule, the establishment returned to power in a once more polytheistic society.